Welcome to the very first Eider Day. It's the 20th of March 2021. I'm Paul Morrison and I'm the RSPB's Coquet Island site manager. Coquet Island is one of the homes of the eider duck on the Northumberland coast. Today we're going on a journey along the Eider coast. That's the Northumberland coast. And it's called the Eider coast because everywhere you go along this coastline you'll find eider ducks. In havens, in ports, in harbours, along the full length. But on top of that, there are special places for eider, such as Farn, right at the top. That's a National Nature Reserve, and it currently is a haven for over 550 eiders, rather than a nest site. Further down the coast is the National Trust property of the Farn Islands. Now that's a mecca for eider ducks, and whenever you go across to see the spectacle of the birds on the Farn Islands, you'll always see an eider duck. Further down the coast, off Amble, is Coquet Island. That's an RSPB reserve. And Coquet Island is currently the southernmost breeding colony of eider on the east coast of England. Starting at the south end of the Northumberland coastline is Coquet Island. It's only 8 hectares. But it has a bird assemblage of some 70,000 nesting seabirds, and part of that assemblage is the eider duck. They like to nest on the grassland plateau that forms the main body of the island. The other features on the island is a lighthouse that you can see from the mainland and a small beach at the south end. That's really the airport for Coquet Island, where the birds arrive and depart at the start and the finish of every season. Further north from Coquet Island is the National Trust property, the Farn Islands. Now this is the main home of the eider duck on the Northumberland coast, due to the number of nesting females that you find there. This photograph shows Inner Farn, and you can see again a lighthouse and part of the old buildings and chapel that are accommodation for the National Trust rangers. Eiders on that island are a delight to see because they nest right next to the paths where the visitors walk. Going back in time, a local Celtic saint, St Cuthbert, is well known as an island hopper on the Northumberland coast. This carving represents St Cuthbert visiting Coquet Island in 684, where he was offered the bishopric of Lindisfarne. St Cuthbert was reputed to be a protector of eider ducks, but this is more of a legend rather than a fact. But that legend has stuck. Wherever you seem to see an image or a tapestry, in this case at Wallington Hall at National Trust property, here is King Edfrid meeting St Cuthbert on the Farn Islands, and you can see eider duck at his feet. And eider ducks even appear on stained glass windows. This is a photograph of St Cuthbert's Church in Amble, and you can see the eider at his feet, and even on the stained glass windows behind St Cuthbert's tomb in Durham Cathedral there are eiders present. Next time you go, have a little look. Now turning to the eiders themselves, this lovely photograph is a male eider. Very, very clear black and white markings, and with a green nape at the back of its neck. The male eiders are quite showy offy birds, and they have a remarkable call, almost the avian version of a wolf whistle, to draw the attention of the females. Eiders tend to pursue several females at the same time. It's part of their biology to help them be a successful species. In contrast to the male eider, the female at a distance looks really drab and brown and dull, but when you get close to her and you have the privilege of seeing an eider on a nest, you'll realize her feathering is magnificent. Beautiful patterns. That's all part of her ability to blend into the environment for when she's nesting. And that camouflage ability helps protect her against predation, particularly from birds like large gulls. This one's nesting amongst tall vegetation. This one's nesting in more open ground, but again in a little hollow, surrounded by flowers and rough grassland, and she still camouflages really well. In fact, you'll get them nesting anywhere where there's a suitable quiet location, secluded and away from disturbance. This one, you can see clearly the feathers around the nest. The female eider plucks her own breast feathers and uses that down to create the warm, snuggly nest for the ducklings when they hatch. This female is obviously aware of the presence of the photographer because she's got a head classically pointing down, pretending not to be there. They're very tolerant of humans, and you can get quite close to them quite often, and they won't fly away. They'll even use structures that we've installed. This is a Trinity House solar panel system on Coquet Island, and it's ideal nesting space for eiders. If you look down below, under the canopy of the solar panels, there are several eiders taking advantage of the shelter and the seclusion offered by the solar panels. So it's a very useful extra nesting habitat for eider ducks on Coquet Island. The resourcefulness of eiders knows no bounds. This is an eider duck on the Farn Islands under a public seat used by hundreds of people during the season. She nested there unperturbed by the people around her and above her. Once the National Trust realised where she was, they fenced off that seat so she could have more peace and quiet. And now I'll introduce you to Winnie the eider duck. Winnie nested outside the tower door on the Farn Islands for over 14 seasons. Sadly, she didn't return in 2014, but the longevity of eiders is remarkable. From ring recoveries, it's common to find evidence of birds over 25 years old. The practice of eider lifting is carried out by the rangers on the farms. The rangers need to know just how well the birds are doing, how many eggs they're laying. So it's a simple technique. The birds are tolerant enough to allow the ranger to lift them off the nest site, check the eggs and pop them back down again. On Coquet Island, this is an old netty that used to be used by the lighthouse keepers in the 20s. And lo and behold, their nesting every year is an eider duck, arrowed on this photograph, quietly secluded away from all predation and disturbance. Females take on the duty of looking after the nest, incubating the eggs, and once the ducklings hatch, as you can see in this photograph, she obviously looks after them before leading them away down to the water's edge. You can see from this photograph the down around the nest site that keeps those eggs warm and the ducklings snug. Incredibly, the ducklings only stay at the nest site for up to about 48 hours. After that, the female calls and coaxes them down to the sea to take them on a journey, either from the Farns or from Coquet Island, in search of shelter and good feeding for the ducklings. As the ducklings leave their nest sites and head down to the rocks or the beaches, they're joined by other non-breeding female eiders. They're called aunties, and they help the parents of the eider ducklings to form large creches to offer them a little bit extra safety on their way across to the mainland from the relative island they've come from. In some cases, it's quite a journey. If you look at the front of this photograph, there's a creche of eider ducks with their ducklings heading for the port of Amble in the distance. You can see the harbour mouth, that's where they're heading for. Somehow these birds know that in that harbour are good feeding in the mudflats upon which the ducklings depend. Here's the harbour from the air. They make the journey into the harbour mouth, all the way up the river, past all the sailing boats and onto the mudflats, because the mudflats are the place where the ducklings look for their food source. They're looking for invertebrates in that mud. On the Farn Islands, they have a little bit of a break because there's a pond in a farn, and they spend a little bit of time there doing a little bit of initial feeding before they head to sea. The ducklings are quite small in size when they obviously head to water, quite a miracle really, but their feet are huge, and of course they need their big feet for paddling and getting them across the water to the estuaries or to the safety of Sea Houses Harbour or little bays or inlets where they can seek refuge. The aunties are constantly on the lookout and very attentive. At night time the ducklings either go onto a beach or onto rocks just to get out the water where they can preen and shelter and rest until the following day. A lot of preening goes on. They spend an enormous amount of time preening because they spend a lot of time in the water. At this stage in their development, you can see from the bird on the right, they've got tiny wings, so everything is done with their feet. They dive, go under the water in seek of insects, invertebrates under the water, as well as in the mudflats. They're very, very adaptable. Lots of studies have taken place on eider duck over the years. A long study on Coquet for over 50 years by Dr. John Colson, and more recently, for the last 30 years, one of our volunteers for the Coquet Island has been looking at the distribution and the numbers of eider duckling arriving on the Coquet estuary. And you can see from this chart that the peak numbers of arrivals from Coquet Island is middle of June, where numbers peak, and then as the season progresses, fewer and fewer arrive in the estuary, and the numbers finally deplete by August time. All is not well with the eider duck on the Northumberland coast. There's a steady decline going on for many years. On the Farn Islands, shown in red on this chart, you can see the decline is very dramatic, and even on Coquet Island, where the population is smaller, but it is still declining. You can see that from the dotted blue line showing that trend. The black line on this chart is the total of farns and Coquet birds. Up on Lindisfarne, at designation in 1990, there were some 2,500 Eiders. Now that has fallen by 75% to 562. The Eiders are in trouble, and the conservation bodies are trying to get behind the understanding of why this is happening and what we can do about it. By the turn of the century, the islands were very popular for visitors, and visitors sadly used to collect the birds' eggs, and in particular eider eggs, for food. So the problems with eider duck go back a long way. Disturbance of birds' nest sites goes back a long time too. This is a very old postcard. It's a photograph taken on the Farn Islands of somebody exploring cormorants' nests. No cormorants in sight, so they've obviously fled. And nowadays, of course, protection of the birds is paramount and carefully controlled on both the Farn Islands and on Coquet Island. Disturbance is still an issue, but the main threat to the eider is one of predation. Large gulls are the main culprit. You can see from the main photograph on this slide, there's a juvenile gull with an eider egg in its mouth. The top left-hand photograph is a crow at an eider nest, and the result of that predation can be seen from the middle slide on the left-hand side. That's an eider egg that's got clear marks that it's been taken by a larger bird. It doesn't stop there though. The ducklings leaving the island sets for the mainland are also subject to predation by large gulls coming in and picking them out of the water. And even the adults themselves are vulnerable to the very largest of the gulls, the great blackback gull, that can kill an eider very, very easily. Eiders are also exposed to predation by mammals such as otter and rat. Not very common, thank goodness. The main photograph on this slide shows an otter on Coquet Island a couple of years ago. Luckily it only stayed a season and didn't come back, but while it was on the island, it took lots and lots of puffins, adult puffins. We have had the occasional rat on Coquet Island as well, and similarly on the Farn Islands they are exposed to these kinds of predation. but thankfully not very common. Our worry is, and we always check the site from the winter onwards, this is a footprint on the beach on Coquet Island left by an otter, and I've put an old Zippo lighter of mine, funny enough, with an eider duck on to gauge the size. Once we look for the signs and find them, we then have to put in place biosecurity measures to safeguard the main species on the island. Another threat is the weather. The roseate terns have a terrace on this photograph that's breached by the sea. Even in the summertime these days, there seems to be an increased frequency of summer storms on high tides. So that also impacts on eider duck as well. Diet is another threat to eiders. They're commonly found in places like amble and sea houses, and the temptation to feed them chips and any offcuts or bits of bread is there, but please don't. Eiders' natural food include crabs and shellfish such as mussels. In fact, their crops are reinforced very strong, and if you're very quiet and listen to an eider eating a mussel, you can hear the mussel crunching in their crops. But if you feed them the wrong diet and they're easily fooled into eating the wrong stuff, then they develop a thing called aeroplane wing. And this bird in the foreground on this photograph shows the result of aeroplane wing, where the wing doesn't develop properly. So please help the eider, don't feed them. Conservation of eider ducks on Coquet Island go back a long way. Back in the 1920s, the RSPB approached the principal keeper on Coquet Island and offered him an honorarium, the princely sum of £5 a year, to prevent people landing on Coquet Island to take the eider eggs for food. So that set the scene way back in the 1920s for Coquet Island becoming a sanctuary in 1970. The main threat to eider ducks is predation, and that's mainly by large gulls. So a lot of thought has gone into ways of chasing them off, keeping them at bay, stopping them attacking eider ducks. One such method is the use of a laser gun. It was designed originally for keeping birds off airports to prevent bird strikes, but it's a very effective non-lethal method to scare off birds. You shine the laser beam at the bird's feet, the large gull's feet, and they take off. They don't like it at all. That's one of several techniques we use to keep the island clear of large gulls, to prevent them from setting up their territories and then becoming a problem for the birds. Another threat to the birds on Coquet Island are egg thieves. There are still people around in our communities that would collect birds' eggs if they could. Coquet Island, being the sole place for finding roseate terns, is a target for egg thieves, and that in turn of course means that the eiders are vulnerable along with other birds for having their eggs stolen. To combat that, the RSPB have a team of wardens that operate 24/7. We have a special hide constructed on the jetty so they can be based right at the point where boats would try and land, and in that way we keep the problem at bay. We've also turned to technology to safeguard the birds on Coquet Island, mainly the terns, but of course the eiders benefit as well. These cameras are so sophisticated, so sensitive, they can see into the dark, so we can guard the birds from the safety of the lighthouse or down at the jetty in the hide. The main photograph on this slide shows it was the 9th of July 2020, 9 minutes past 3 in the morning, and you can see every single bird on the island. A very effective way of guarding the birds from potential egg thieves that try to sneak onto the island in the middle of the night. On the Farn Islands, there's yet another way they're helping the eider ducks. On the left-hand photograph, you can see the boardwalk that visitors can use to get right across the island without damaging the habitat. And there on the side of the boardwalk is an eider duck nesting. Occasionally the ducklings, once hatched, can fall down the gaps in the boardwalk, so the rangers on the farms carry out a boardwalk duty to rescue any ducklings that get trapped under that boardwalk. Earlier I mentioned about the eider ducks having the ability to form creches. If an eider duckling is stranded or lost, it's a common practice for the rangers on the farms or the wardens on Coquet to pick up the eider ducklings, go to the mainland, find a creche and release it next to that creche, and within minutes that duckling is adopted by the aunties looking after them. Another way of helping eider is by creating more nest sites. Here on Coquet Island we've laid some rocks in rows across the plateau with little bays at intervals. Within one season the eiders take advantage of these little bays to set down their nests. On this photograph, if you look very carefully, you can see 2 eider duck doing just that. Tall rank grass is another problem for eider. The ducklings find it very difficult to get through this grass to the shore. So here on Coquet Island we've strimmed eider escape routes. These are channels that the ducklings can be led along to get to the shoreline quite safely. This eider duck wasn't quite clued up. She decided to put her nest on a shingle beach on Coquet. And we know when the high tides are, and especially the spring tides, that a spring tide would be a problem for her. So we spent an afternoon busily creating a rock armour around that nest site. She was very tolerant, putting up with us right next to her, and when the high tide came, she was safe. And this was the high tide, a high spring tide, hitting that rock armour wall, and the eider sitting tight, watching it. She managed to successfully hatch and rear a brood of 5 eider ducklings. Conservation in practice. It's always been quite common to see a lot of males pursuing one female, but in recent years that disparity seems to have grown, and we're getting more and more signs of too many males for females, and that is a problem for the eiders to be successful. Here on the Farn Islands there's a female being pursued by up to 5-6 males, even when she's sorting out her nest. In recent times, this disparity is rendering itself obvious on Coquet Island. Normally on the island there'd only be females tending the nest, but now we're seeing males hanging about, pursuing females, even on the nest. And out at sea, with ducklings heading for the harbour, we've witnessed eider males still pursuing the females, so it's an indicator that there's something not quite right with the eider population at the moment in their behaviour. Ways of helping eider indirectly include the production of things like interpretation panels. This was a panel produced a few years ago that was on display in Amble. It raises awareness of just how important it is to look after our native species on the Northumberland coast. Other ways of raising awareness include the production of a leaflet on the left-hand side of this slide. The gentleman on the right was recording the eider call as part of a promotion. He arrived at Amble Marina ready to record eider duck at distance using a parabolic recording device. It wasn't needed. The eider was so close, all he had to do was put the microphones onto a coat hanger. And of course there's the paraphernalia and memorabilia to support the eider duck. In fact, there was a conservation team established for over 20 years to do conservation work, not just on eider but up and down the coast. But the eider being present up and down our Northumberland coastline was a good symbol, a good logo to raise awareness of conservation in general. Even the harbour commissioners at Amble, it's Warkworth Harbour Commissioners to be correct, they've adopted the eider within the crest for the harbour, and the eider duck features in one of the quadrants bottom left as a nod to the conservation importance of the estuary to eider ducks. It plays a vital part in the successful continuation of the eider species. Well, in conclusion, I'd like to thank various people for helping me with slides and knowledge and putting these slides together. And no Eider Day would be complete without flying a flag. Here on Coquet Island, we're raising the flag to the eider duck. So next time you're out and about on the Northumberland coast, keep a lookout for the eider duck. Enjoy their beauty and splendour and help conserve this wonderful species on our coastline. Thank you very much.